Okay, now I guess it's time to start since the lights have come up and I can't see anything. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to this session of the 2022 AFA Aerospace Warfare Symposium. Today we've got a fantastic panel to discuss an area of immense growth, that being the key technologies that are driving space innovation. I don't think I have to tell this crowd too often that space is a warfighting domain. Obviously, Russia and China have made that very clear. And while the United States has worked for decades to keep space peaceful, given adversary actions, we've got to respond. Now, the capabilities that exist on orbit are simply too important to risk. We need to present senior leaders with a range of effective options, and that means pursuing both defensive and offensive capabilities, just like we have in every other domain. Achieving this is going to demand aggressive innovation. Much of our capabilities on orbit today speak to an earlier time in space when the domain was not contested. The technologies, operational concepts, and strategies we'll need to operate successfully need to be manifested in the operational realm, and that needs to happen as soon as possible. That's why I'm especially pleased to have some key figures with us today who are going to help us generate these new capabilities. So with that bit of background, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Costa, Chief Technology and Innovation Officer of the U.S. Space Force, Frank DeMauro, Vice President of Strategic Deterrent Systems in the Space Systems sector at Northrop Grumman, and Nick Bucci, Vice President of Program Management with General Atomics. So what I'd like to do is start off with Dr. Costa and ask her if she could give us a quick rundown on what key technologies your office is pursuing to equip our Space Force, given the challenges in space. And then after that, we'll be followed by Nick and Frank.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank AFA in particular for putting this symposium together. It's been fantastic. And I know it takes a lot of work. The CTIO office is unique across the services. There is no other service that has a Chief Technology Innovation Officer. And why that is most services have CIOs, right? We have a CIO in the Department of the Air Force. But what we wanted within Space Force was someone whose full-time job it was to focus on asymmetric threats and opportunities. So we have critical areas that we're focused on more than specific single technologies, because there are a lot of technologies that go into space, right? We could actually talk about whole sectors, right? Energy, IT, space, et cetera. So what I would say is we're really more focused on 6 primary activities. The first is improving the freedom of action in space, and you can think about AI and ML, advanced analytics, providing space awareness to everyone, not just within Space Force, but across the services, our international partners, and industry as well. The second is improving survivability, resilient architectures. The third is digital engineering, not just in the acquisition arena, but all the way through the thread of acquisition to training, to force design, to operations. In other words, train the way we fight and fight the way we train. Responsible AI, ML, and autonomy. Wow, that's just huge in and of itself, right? A great deal of energy going into how we trust algorithms and to what degree the human is in, on, and off the loop. The fifth area is improving space access, mobility, and logistics. And this is really a critical area in that if something goes wrong in space, we're not there physically, right, to fix it. And so we're really looking at things like, in situ resourcing, material located within space to be able to use additive manufacturing in orbit. So there are a lot of activities going on in the research of how you will even generate additional space assets in space, right? Not even starting off on the ground and needing lift. And then the sixth area, is enhancement and integration of the current services that we already provide. And that encompasses, anything from search and rescue, space commerce defense, ISR, et cetera. So many technologies, and I would highlight that we do have a long-term S&T plan to get after that, and that was published in September of last year, and I would recommend folks go out and get a copy of that online. Thank you.
You bet, Nick.
Thanks, General. Everyone can hear me, I hope. So I want to kind of center my comments, because this is about innovation, about what is driving that innovation. And from a perspective of where I'm sitting and standing at General Atomics, it's all about size, weight, and power improvements in terms of capabilities. And so when you think about, if I can reduce the size of a focal plane array to then be able to see a certain type of object at a certain range, I now have shrunk down the optics, I've shrunk down the size of the spacecraft on which that sensor needs to sit, and now all of a sudden it opens a tremendous amount of space, excuse the pun there, for being able to do things differently. And that's kind of really the driver, is being able to, I like to say, do bigger missions with smaller spacecraft. And what that means is, I may be able to do things with a 0.5 kilogram satellite in a certain regime, all the way up to being able to take on some of the toughest missions with, say, only a 500 kilogram satellite instead of a 5,000 kilogram satellite. And so that's really the thought process, is take advantage of the evolution of technology and the innovation and figure out how to make it come into this mission, especially as we move into this standing up of the Space Force and I'll say the admission of space being a warfighting domain. The second point is access to space. Access to space has become much more reasonably priced. As a result, now I can do some of that innovation and I can get it on orbit faster and cheaper. And then kind of adjunct to both of those is the fact that I can get inside the technology development loop of those innovations, right? Think of a fire control loop. I know Dr. Schmidt said OODA loop was confusing and people hate the word, but think of it as a decision loop. If I can get inside the acquisition timelines fast enough to take advantage of the evolution of innovation, now I can deliver that new capability, again, shrinking down the size of sensors, shrinking down the size of communication packages, et cetera, and deliver that capability much faster. Rather than having to wait 15 years, I can wait 3 years, 5 years, and get it on orbit much faster. And then I guess the last point is in terms of getting people who want to do innovation to be part of this community. I think for space, it's a lot easier. There is a lot of movement of personnel amongst different companies and things like that, and it's because it's a really cool mission. Again, stealing from Dr. Schmidt's comments last night, we're lucky in the space community that people want to do this work. When I was a kid, my brother's a little bit older than me, he wanted to be an astronaut. Well, he's a plumber, so that didn't come true for him. But everybody had that dream of doing something like the Apollo missions we're driving toward. And so I think that's a big deal for us. But getting people interested, getting soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women as they come out of the service interested in doing this mission is important. And then the important piece is retaining them by keeping them interested in the mission areas, and frankly, developing new mission areas. I think it was General Gutlein about a year ago said, one of the things that he thinks we should be doing is looking at how can I take advantage of other missions that we have done that have been, I'll say, adjunct space missions, like missile defense. How do I take some of those technologies in and take advantage of them, whether it's actual pieces of hardware, whether it's approaches to software, or it's just how I do my command and control processes. And so I think those are kind of the coalescing principles around how we need to take advantage of innovation for space.
No, that's very good. I would suggest, too, the Space Force, the quickest way to adapt Missile Defense Agency innovation and ideas is by putting the Missile Defense Agency inside the Space Force. But that's another subject. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, General. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Great to be on this panel. I guess I'll focus on a couple of different technologies that are in various stages that we've done. The first one I'll talk about is our investment in space logistics and space mobility technologies. Northrop Grumman invested several years ago, began investing in what we call the Mission Extension Vehicle, a pure commercial investment in developing a technology to rendezvous and dock with existing commercial geo satellites that are performing a perfectly fine mission, just happen to be running out of fuel, where we would piggyback on the back of that spacecraft and take over its attitude control systems and propulsion systems and extend the life of that revenue-generating spacecraft. And we've delivered 2 of those spacecraft. They successfully docked with 2 different commercial spacecraft. In fact, the last one we did last year, MEV-2, docked with an Intelsat satellite, which was actually in the GEO arc, transferring traffic for its customers, and there was no interruption of traffic, and that was the first time that was done. And really, it was a commercial venture that we knew would have other applications beyond the commercial arena. And now, since then, we are investing in the next generation or 2 of that capability to where we can put robotics in space, where we can do repairs of spacecraft in space. We could do assembly of spacecraft in space, like Dr. Costa was talking about. We can go up in space and interchange payloads as technologies improve or requirements change. And so that investment's, I think, a really strong example where we saw a need for a technology, we invested in it, and then we fielded it. And so far, it's quite successful. So we're looking forward to being eventually fielding the next version of that technology in the 2024 timeframe. Another version, which is of technology, we invested in radar technologies so that the government could look out and use ground-based radars to look out into the geostationary arc and see what else is out there and do surveillance of the arc and combine and use that capability to combine with space-based assets to give a fuller picture of what's out there. And that investment in that technology will eventually be fielded on something called DARC, the Deep Space Advanced Radar capability. And so that's some of the work we did in our Baltimore facility. Really strong investment and a lot of great technology, and now soon, a few years from now, we'll be fielding that technology. And then the last piece I'll talk about is something, and it's consistent with another item that Dr. Costa talked about, which is the digital transformation and digital engineering. You know, there's one of the programs in my portfolio, GBSD, huge program. We've made tremendous strides in digital engineering, model-based systems engineering, but we're really trying to push it further from the corporation on down throughout the organization, so where it's more of a digital ecosystem, so that we are not just doing digital engineering, but digital manufacturing, physics-based modeling and simulation, and applying that across the spectrum of what we do, from the acquisition phase to the fielding phase to the learning and training phase of programs. And so we're excited about those snippets of technologies that we've been investing in.
Well, thanks very much, Frank, and all of you. Now let's kind of dig down into some of these details with some specific questions. Dr. Costa, budgets are obviously tight, especially given the demand for new capabilities and additive capacity that's on Space Force's plate. Could you speak a bit to how you're setting up your tech development and investment priorities? What determines whether something falls above or below the cut line? I should say the funding line, not the cut line.
Right. Well, it's all about prioritization, as you know. And it's also about partnership. And this is really where industry is absolutely critical. Space Force will not be the organization that puts, for example, IT infrastructure into space. That's really going to be the job of industry because they see the value of being able to provide cloud-based services globally. We want to take advantage of that, right? And so that is an area that we don't necessarily then have to invest significant funding, but we do have to invest significant kind of blood, sweat, and tears to make sure that the partnerships are there and that we have a voice in terms of how we want information to move in and across space. And so here's a great example of that. As we rely more on artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomy, a lot of assets in space don't have that computational power to actually perform any of the analysis. We don't want to have to move a lot of data to ground stations. Instead, we'd love instead to be able to process information on orbit and then move that around space without ever touching ground. And so I think that's really a key area that, again, partnering with industry is critical. I love the topic of the digital ecosystem, right? So absolutely ensuring that it gets driven down to every single Guardian. And we are focused very much on that. A lot of our funding is focused on digital university, digital headquarters, and digital operations, and making sure that we are providing an environment for Guardians to be able to interact with their environment. I have this scenario where I, identify that if you are a sailor, you have kind of the feel of the waves beneath you. You have the feel of the sun on your face. If you're a soldier, you feel the mud, as you're crawling through, a field. But a Guardian only experiences their environment, their operational domain through digital data. So I would encourage industry to think about how we provide an environment where those Guardians can interact with their environment in an augmented reality perspective so that they can use their 5 senses with their operational domain.
No, that's great. I just reiterate some of the comments that were made by leadership yesterday in terms of the importance. Although as simple as it seems, IT infrastructure needs a lot of attention in all of our services. And you very clearly pointed out why it's particularly important to folks in the Space Force. Is there just a bit of a follow-up? Is there, other than IT and networks and getting our act together in that regard, are there other areas that you would like to, how would you, what is another priority that you would like to see attention paid to by the Space Force?
So I would say that that entire ecosystem of ensuring that we have resources in space that are able to be quickly used, right? It is not always an option to have liftoff, right? And do that in a time frame that makes sense. And so being able to focus on additive manufacturing in space, being able to have material depots in space, in situ power development in space is really critical. And again, this is something that will not be unique to Space Force. With the growth of commercial space assets, everyone will need this, right? Everyone will need the ability to, have on-demand services in space. And so I think that is a key area that I'd love to see focus on without requiring, the cost of lift and then the challenge of lift if there's weather and all kinds of other things that that might perturb you from getting capability on orbit as quickly as possible.
Yeah, your previous point too, in terms of the capacity and capability to conduct onboard processing, also is applicable to many, many other things. Our whole ISR infrastructure is based on an archaic model where you download everything and then you figure out what it is you need after you download it. Well, that's kind of ridiculous, given the amount of data that one collects, and 99% of it's garbage anyway. So figure that out before you translate and move what you want to do. No, thanks very much for that. Now, Nick and Frank, as we listen to Dr. Costa, it's clear that the demand for space capability is surging. That's going to demand more industrial capacity. So how do you look at this from your respective vantage points? And do some of these variables represent greater challenges than others?
Sure. Okay. Of course, there's a lot of differences, right? Some things are much more challenging than others. But when it comes to it, you have to look at it from, I'll say, from an industry perspective, at least 3 different dimensions, and that's financial, technology, and people. Do I have the right resources in those 3 dimensions to be able to support what I need, whether it's new capital equipment, whether it's new training for people, or whether it's a new piece of technology to be able to accomplish a new goal. Things like, can we bring new sources of energy to do on orbit, what you were just talking about, Dr. Costa, whether it's on-orbit refueling, whether it's providing a new source of power and energy on orbit, and essentially getting rid of things like solar panels on orbit. New ways to do battery work, all of those things. So each of those, I think, will help us make the decisions as to what are the right things to go off and pursue. And frankly, it's constant communications between the Space Force and industry is the only way to get that right. What are the right priorities, and where is the right thing for us to invest, and essentially ensure that we're meeting the demand that the Space Force wants.
Yeah, and I think from a industry capacity point of view, I think I don't agree with what Nick said, but I think just to add to that, there's obviously the physical capacity of getting hardware through factories, whether it's Northrop Grumman or one of our partners on our programs. There's a lot of stuff moving through factories these days, and the factories need to be sized to be able to handle all that. But at the same time, you want to right-size them for lots of reasons. One, you want to optimize your investments, but 2, you want to have the right-size footprint, not only physically, but also from a carbon standpoint, as we think about sustainability. I think the people piece is huge. I think right now the competition for talent out there is increasing, as all of us in the industry are very busy, and so making sure we're getting the right people in the positions in the company to be able to do all the great work that needs to get done to support these great programs, these great initiatives, and then to feel the investment that we're doing. And I think another piece of this is, as we're thinking about these factories and what we're going to be delivering from a hardware and software point of view, I think we also need to think about, how do we design them? What's the smartest way we could do it? These smart factories and factories of the future, we've all heard those terms. I think those are real things, because I think as we're figuring out the flexibility we need to have in our systems, we also need to have the flexibility in our facilities and in our systems to be able to pivot quickly, to be able to be agile in what we're delivering to the customers. Because at the end of the day, as we field things more and more quickly, we're going to have to figure out how to make sure that it's meeting the needs of the warfighter. And as those requirements change, and they're changing very quickly these days, our systems have to pivot to support that.
Can I just add one more
Yeah,
thing,
sure.
General? Yeah, as Frank was talking, I was thinking another important dimension is teaming amongst industry. Essentially to what you're saying, Frank, in terms of maximizing the efficiency of footprints and sustainability, et cetera. I don't know that there are many programs where a single company, top to bottom, can essentially bid and produce everything in an efficient manner. And so I think teaming amongst industry and frankly teaming with the government as we go through acquisitions and development and fielding and operations is really important too. So
That's very good, which is a great segue into this next question that I've got for Dr. Costa. For too long we've heard about this critical barrier, if you will, that stands in the way between fielding new innovative operational capability, and that's the valley of death. As most of you all know, this involves innovating a new technology, but then failing to find a sponsor who can bring it on board. So how's the Space Force addressing this challenge?
That is a great question, and I think that that the Space Force is small for a reason, right? The Space Force is focused on being able to iterate very quickly, and while there are some challenges with that, the value of being small is that we can shepherd particular initiatives and activities and ensure that they are not even encountering, right, that valley of death. So, a great initiative that we're looking at is how to create this metaverse, right, for the Space Force. How do we create this immersive environment that includes digital engineering, modeling and simulation, AI, and then all of the kind of the haptic sensory feedback to the Guardian so that they can make better decisions. We are working with industry and academia to help make that happen, and those investments, though, are in turn are really fueling industry's approach and desire to enter the metaverse, right? So I think where we can find opportunities that meet both industry's needs and Space Force's needs, that's critical. I do want to highlight, though, something that Frank said, and it really is all about the people. The greatest pleasure that I have is, the other day I visited University of Central Florida, and I had the opportunity to sit down for an hour and a half with our ROTC cadets. And let me tell you, absolutely, these are individuals who are dedicated to the mission, incredibly brilliant. I have nothing but high hopes for the future when I talk to them. But the key will be to put into their hands the tools that they need to bring us in to the next century of space and not give them 30-year-old technology. And that's absolutely critical because, they go out to their cars and have better technology than that we're providing them on their desktop. So I think that's the challenge. And I also like to highlight what Nick said, which is I see much more teaming between government and industry. I see that relationship becoming much stronger, and us working on common areas of interest, perhaps in different ways than we have in the past, where we just let a contract and maybe it's more, though, than a CRADA, right? So there's there's the spectrum of CRADA, and then there's this, contracting, but there's a lot between there. And I think there's opportunity space for Space Force and industry to explore that together.
No, that's very good, and that's a great segue back to Frank and Nick. This phenomena is not just restricted to the government. Industry has challenges to face in the context of how you're going to spend your IRAD monies, and then you've got the same complications with continuing resolutions. And Dr. Costa kind of already led into the answer to this question, but I mean, I'll give you an opportunity too in the context of being able to work together better in the future than perhaps we have in the past. Your thoughts on these issues?
I'll start. Yeah, on that last point, yeah, I agree with Nick and Dr. Costa. If you look at the biggest program in my portfolio, of course, GBSD, an enormous enterprise that we've undertaken here. This is a national team. Northrop Grumman may be the lead, but Lockheed Martin's on the team, and Boeing's on the team, and General Dynamics, and Aerojet Rocketdyne, and I'm not going to name all of them. But if you look at the map that we created to show the people who come and visit us and see what we're doing on GBSD, the map is covered with participation from Northrop Grumman across the country, but all of our partners across the country. And so that amount of teaming to bring the capabilities to bear on such a critical program, the ability to do that extremely well, I think is critical to the success of the program. And I think to add to something Dr. Costa also said, the interaction between my team and the government team on the development of that program, and they are intertwined really strongly to where as we move the development of that system into the cloud environment, that the folks at Hill Air Force Base right outside my office door will have access to the same data and the same models and the same analysis that my team does without having to transfer it via email. Those types of things I think are going to be integral into pushing us faster while not losing any of the capabilities that we need to provide in the system. I think in terms of the investment conversation, it is critical. We look at the priorities that we think our customers have, but clarity from our customers is really helpful in figuring out where we want to put those investment dollars. Sometimes we're going to invest because we know there's a direction that the customer wants to go, and sometimes we're going to put money and invest in things that we think will differentiate ourselves in the marketplace, and sometimes they're very much combined. And so as we decide where to place those bets, as we call it, it's a very iterative process, not only in talking to the customers and figuring out what direction we want to go, but also looking at, okay, we invested X dollars in the last quarter. How is that looking? Let's continuously reevaluate it efficiently, though, because you don't want to keep throwing money and then having to pull back. So you have to make the right decisions, but you have to give yourself the ability to change course at a very quick pace to make sure you're keeping up with what the customers are looking for.
Nick? Yeah, I guess I'll just repeat the 3 C's, but a little bit differently. We heard it twice yesterday, but the 3 C's that I'll use are communications, communications, communications. And that happens, I'll add one more thing between CRADA and contract, Dr. Costa, and that's, the OTA process that is now that Space Force has been pursuing some of those. That is huge, because what that enables us to do is have communications through the parts of the development process continuously so that we're going down the right path. So many times the valley of death is encountered because someone feels threatened by an innovation, right? It's threatening someone's franchise, in an industry or in government, right? And so they will battle to essentially say how that innovation can't possibly make it through the valley of death to ensure that they can continue to do things like planned product improvements and things like that to their programs. So I think that's really the big thing. And I really like the thing you talked about, because Space Force is small now, it's going to get bigger. But I would say it will still be a classic tweener kind of organization, right? Not too big, not too small. And there was a Harvard Business Review a long time ago that talked about, as a tweener, the small folks look up to you and say, you're big, you got all the processes and all of those kinds of things, and that envy. And the big guys look down at you and say, you're nimble, you're fast, you're innovative. The point of the study was it requires focus, laser focus, again, excuse this pun, on exactly what those investments need to be. And when you talked about how you want to keep the Space Force small and essentially do a very good job of focusing on exactly where to go to avoid the valley of death, that's a perfect spot.
Well, very good. Excuse me, Dr. Costa. We're getting ready to see the acquisition, if you will, inside the Space Force of one of its first major external organizations, and that's the Space Development Agency. How do you view your role changing as SDA comes on board our Space Force?
So I don't view the role of the CTIO as changing, but I do view it as an additional partner that we especially can ensure that we're taking advantage of the capabilities that they have built up, right? And we're already working with them. I mean, this is not something where we're waiting and, and then we'll start working with SDA. So we're working very hard to take advantage of what they've already been doing. I want to just identify that we don't view, I started this conversation off with, we don't view any single technology, right, as being kind of the key to space. And it's really the convergence of technology and the novel convergence of technology that will have the most tremendous impact, right, on space. And it's really not even government that will have the greatest impact. It is industry and how it changes the sociocultural fabric of our citizens that will have the greatest impact on space. So as we talk about science and technology, and I said this to our team who focuses on futures, always think about the impact of the sociocultural fabric of what industry is developing for citizenry, because that will have direct impact on what we do, and it will have direct impact on how we work with SSC, SDA, and others as well.
Well, very good. Either of you care to comment on that whole SDA issue? You don't have to. I mean, I just offer.
Well, the only thing I'll say is that I think it's a positive progression of driving where I think it'll be a more nimble application and communication of what's really required by the Space Force that will enable industry to respond in a more effective way. I think we're seeing that already in some of the SDA work we're doing. So I think that as that takes more and more hold, but really, not to be dramatic, but unleashes what industry can bring, I think that's going to be the real benefit of SDA to the Space Force.
And all I'd add is Dr. Tournier is taking almost the same approach, right? Stay small, stay nimble, stay innovative, and that will fit in well.
Well, very good. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our session today. Dr. Costa, Nick, Frank, thank you very much for taking the time to share with us your perspectives. I think the audience, and certainly I found them very illuminating. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thanks. Please join me in thanking our guests and have a great aerospace power kind of day.